So our last guest was Charlie Laser of Blue Dot and Flat Pack in the prefabricated housing and the online furniture business. And I thought that was a really good lecture and discussion about the distinction between prototypical design and one-off single project or single problem kind of design. And I think we'll be able to probably talk about that quite a bit today. Today I would like to introduce our guest, my friend of longstanding and professor in the School of Architecture, Tim Love. Tim is an associate professor at the school and a founding principal of the firm Utile, which is a really innovative enterprise that he will talk more about here. A Boston-based architecture and urban planning firm. Love's teaching, writing, and practice are focused on the revitalization of the American city. His particular expertise falls at the intersection of urban policy, the design of public spaces, and the contribution of individual works of architecture to the larger public realm. As a result, he is at the forefront of several important City of Boston planning initiatives, including the downtown waterfront and the urban district that is being planned adjacent to Boston's new convention center, and I might add, has been a significant player in trying to reimagine Government Center and Boston's City Hall Plaza. So with that, welcome, Tim Love.
Thanks. A couple of things. One is that I actually met George in 1984, so just get your minds around that. And we weren't 2 years old.
No, we were not.
We were not 2 years old. Have any of you been to the Boston Harbor Island Pavilion or walked by it? This is Paul. What are you doing in this class? Hands high. It's right. If you're in Quincy Market and you walk toward the water and you go through that, Paul, you can put your hand down now, and you walk through that curved space. It's right there where the question mark is. And George was very interested in me describing the process of a project, how we get from the commission to a final thing is actually built. And so I had a lot of fun reconstructing the process efficiently for you, but it was enlightening and entertaining for me to go back through all of the PowerPoint shows that we put together for all of the community, client, and agency meetings to actually understand how the whole thing came together. Because, you know, it's a fairly unusual looking building. It's actually an open air structure with 2 roofs and 2 kiosks under it. You might say, I've never seen anything that looks like that ever in my life. How did you come up with that? And I'm going to tell you a little bit the story. And there's so many buttons to push, George. This is all in the name of...
It's progress, my friend.
Progress. So the story starts, the Boston Harbor Island Alliance and the National Park Service and the Boston Redevelopment Authority have a design competition for a visitors pavilion for the Boston Harbor Islands, which happened to be a national park. I don't know if you know that or not, but like the Grand Canyon, our humble Boston Harbor Islands are also a national park. And the result of that competition was this proposal by a certain Stephen Yablon Architecture from New York City, who submitted along with, I think, 122 boards about this big, a concept for this thing. And that was out without any client feedback. There was just a short brief, and there was a site indicated on the Rose Kennedy Greenway. And so, for reasons that still are a mystery to me, and Peter, our very own Peter Wiederspan, by the way, submitted one of the proposals back in 2005. Steve Yablon and team were chosen for this glass box, a perfect glass cube that was transparent and light, and sat on this kind of metaphorical harbor. So in a way, it was a kind of the metaphor of going on an island to learn about the islands. Now, there were a couple of problems with this. One is it would be very hard to keep the temperature in this building below 180 degrees in the summer because it's basically a greenhouse. Secondly, if you look at the floor plan, if you're an architect, there's room for a men and women's bathroom and a couple of cafe tables. So even though the image was compelling, which button do I? This one. Here it is. At night, it's totally cool, and it's got little TV screens. it would be a beautiful thing. Because there was no involvement with stakeholders or a client, soon after architect Yablon was hired, the building changed and changed and changed and changed to the point where nobody liked it. And unfortunately, Steve Yablon was fired because they were tired of flying him up from New York. He was expensive. And so they issued a new request for proposals to start the whole thing reset. The only requirement, and it was a qualifications bid, it wasn't a design bid. And the only qualification is that you had to have an office within 15 miles of the site. Because their only issue was we didn't want to pay for the frickin' train and airfare anymore. But they knew the process was going to be harder than they thought to begin with. And so we applied as a firm, not with a design, but who was going to be on our team, what our qualifications were, and some observations we had about the project. We ended up being on a medium list of 27 firms. We had to do a little bit more clarification of how we would run the job. We ended up being one of 4 finalists they interviewed. It was, again, the city interviewed us, the National Park Service, and the nonprofit, the Harbor Island Alliance, and then we won the project. And I think we ran the project because of my bio that George read, that because I was doing all this public agency work, and they realized what a messed up process this was going to be, because there were so many agencies that own this piece of land. It sits over the Big Dig, so the Federal Highway Administration has to approve the project. It's on the Rose Kennedy Greenway. They have to approve the project. The Boston Redevelopment Authority has to approve the project. That they said, let's get the opposite of Steve Yablon from New York. Let's get Tim Love, who knows all of the public officials, so that there's a path to glory. So I'm being a little bit cynical about myself, which is one of my default personality traits, but it's certainly one of the reasons why we got picked. So what we proposed, which ties, I think, very closely to George's theme this semester, is that rather than be the architects and design the cool glass box, we were going to team with Reed Hildebrand, a landscape architecture firm on the one hand, to think about not just the building, but the whole parcel in relationship to the Greenway, which is a park, by the way, and also IDEO, the kind of design thinking think tank. Have they been in here yet for your class?
No, but we have people.
But they could be.
Yeah.
Continuum is here, right?
No, but they.
Okay, well,
we've had people like that.
IDEO is for example, they're doing a big project now for Sealy, the mattress company, to rethink the mattress, right? So they were the original conceptualizers of the iPod and then the iPhone. So Steve Jobs often got them in early to kind of think through what the new phone could be. So we had some relationships with some people there. And so we said, you so screwed up your last process that we're not going to design a building for you until pretty late in the process. We're going to figure out what you want first, and then we'll design a building for you. So that was a little bit of our pitch. So we had 3 preconceptions that we brought to the interview. One is, people only go to the islands when the weather's nice. You don't need an enclosed building. Have an open air thing. Because nobody's coming to look for the boat tickets when it's snowing out. And the other problem with the first project, they blew the budget, and we knew if it was an open air building, we could actually meet the budget. So this was one. It should be a porch rather than a building. This is day one. Secondly, that the pavilion shouldn't be an isolated thing. The Greenway had just been finished. This thing should be part of the whole Greenway. It's a little bit Captain Obvious, but this is how you make a pitch. And third, that we were going to tie this pavilion deeply into the entire visitor experience. So before we knew what to do, we were going to go learn about what it meant to go to the islands, what was good about it, what was bad about it, before we even had an idea. And so those were our 3 ideas. And so this was our thing. Rather than start with a formal or aesthetic inspiration, like a glass box, we were going to think about how the people were going to interact with the space, why they would come, and what benefits they could derive from it. And the other thing that we did too, and this is a roadmap for my talk, is we said, look, it was back in September of 2008. These are the steps we're going to go through, and we're going to get you into construction by January 2010. I don't want to give away my talk. We did, by the way. And we also walked through in the first meeting how we were going to do this. And I'm not going to go through the steps and details, a little bit too architect-y, but let's just say that you design the building. Well, first you conceptualize it, and then you do the first hard drawings to get everybody to like it. And then you do design development, which is to work out what the materials are. And then you do the working drawings, which are the detailed instructions for the contractor. And then you can start building it. And that, for a public building, is probably from start to starting construction is usually a year to year and a half minimum. So just to give you a little bit of perspective on this. The other thing that we did from the get-go is we broke apart what the possible elements would be, not in a single building, but disaggregated into kind of some thought bubbles for the client, which is you're going to have a ground plane, which you need, and that could be a place where people gather. Maybe you have carts there, and maybe we do some good things for the environment. You're going to want to have display panels about the islands. Again, these are a little bit Captain Obvious, but a good way to start a project. We talked about how these are different. We like to use examples. We call them precedent, kind of a little flavor crystals about how this thing could be. I'm a big fan of the Reese's Peanut Butter Cup analogy, which is it's going to be public art and an exhibit, or it's going to be, sustainable, but also it's going to be cool looking. Like we try to always get double duty out of everything, and so this was a little bit of that story. A little bit how we imagined the landscape around this thing was going to look. Again, getting everybody in a kind of the spirit of what we're up to. And then some other kit of parts thing. Again, back to the porch idea, some performance criteria for this porch. Solar panels, do something cool with the water running off. What's the most shade for people in the park? Like loading up diagrammatically all of the goodness that a roof could do and getting that down immediately. And then where the park rangers would kind of do their thing. And what's really weird is that this kit of parts are fully embedded in the final building. So, and then you might, and what's interesting about it is that you can't really argue with these. It's a little bit like you can't say, no, Tim, I don't think there should be PVs on a roof. Of course there should. So it's a little bit that logic. We even started to think about how tall these things should be really early on. I have the dates of all the stuff I'm showing you down here if you want to keep track. So then what we did is we worked with the IDEO intensively for a month and a half. We went on, and they're pretty fun because they're even more design thinking than we are. So they're cool. They have even bigger glasses than I do. And we went on 2 field trips just before the season was over to the islands, and we interviewed people, and we made little videos, and we had this whole big kind of workshop in their offices. We broke down the visitor sequence into these 4 categories. I'm not going to go into detail. We had photographs of all of those different steps of the sequence, and we learned all kinds of interesting things that we were able to bring back to the pavilion. One of the things that we learned, which was totally hilarious, is that you're all too young to remember Gilligan's Island, probably, right? Remember the show about the shipwreck, 3-hour tour? Did you ever watch it on? Well, everyone's terrified they're going to miss the last boat if they go to the islands. It's the don't abandon me out there syndrome. So we learned all kinds of interesting psychological things about the islands. So here's the steps of the user journey. Again, our process. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm having button problems here. And we actually designed outside of the building components that we were going to put into it later. So one was a big map. The park rangers could mark up blueberries in season, nesting turns, all the things that they like to do on one big map panel and a big map of the city on the other. So we took the kit of parts and we expanded them through this process. Secondly, we were going to have right on the pavilion when the next boat was leaving, immediate satisfaction because the schedule is still a disaster. And we were going to redesign the route map like the subway map so that there was no mystery about, and then we would color code the LED readout to the boat so that you knew what to do. We would color code the tickets out of the ticket kiosk. We put the islands that you were going to on the tickets, and then the boat that was going on that route would fly a flag of that color. Like we said, how do we demystify the whole process? And then in the retail store, we dealt with all the psychological terrors going out there. So we have like snake venom in here, and like a flashlight, and like one of the silver ponchos, just in case you're left behind. It was a little bit tongue-in-cheek to get the national park guys laughing, which is very hard. They don't laugh much. They're very serious. And we'd have a whole, and then we'd have even a way when you're on the islands to take your own bird tour and things like that. So we wrapped this whole thing around a set of strategies that partly had ramifications for the pavilion, and partly were recommendations to the Harbor Alliance and the National Park Service how to do their job better. And we also were very interested in the idea that when you got out there, you'd see the same reassuring LED signs. There's your nice green flag. And then on the boat ride back, which is totally a great boat ride, there'd even be exhibits on the boat so you could understand Boston on your way back. So that was the IDO process, and it was fantastic. Meanwhile, at exactly the same time we were doing that, we had a hunch that where Steve Yablin wanted to put the pavilion was in completely the wrong place. Steve had the pavilion located right there at the corner of State Street and the Greenway, because he didn't realize that the boats don't leave from this dock by the aquarium. They actually leave from this side of the hotel. Right. Why didn't they check? So they had a 6-month process where the pavilion was on the wrong side of the parcel from where you're pointing to where the boats are. And secondly, if you've been to Quincy Market before in the summer, it's like a Dr. Seuss human-making machine. I mean, people pump out of this thing, stumbling into the light, looking for the aquarium. I don't know, 1,000 people, a half an hour. And so we said, let's put the pavilion there, because it'll be like a perfect people catcher, and it'll also be pretty nice that the park rangers can point to where the boats are. And so we had to have this whole, because the Federal Highway Administration, the BRA, the Greenway had all pre-approved that that's where the pavilion was going to go. So we had this whole cockamamie process to put the pavilion where it wanted to be. So the way we did that, I'll show you very quickly. That's where Steve Yablin wanted it. That's our early scheme. We kind of did a little perspective study of where it was. We did a little kind of analysis to show that, yes, it was close to the aquarium access, but it wasn't near the boats. We tried one in the kind of middle creeping up of the parcel. Again, this is State Street at the bottom. Quincy Market's coming out of the top. Did a little perspective. Kind of discredited it in terms of its location. And then got it where we wanted it. Apples to apples is always a way to test things, but also if you're already pre-sure and you need to persuade, it's very successful to kind of tee these things up against each other. And we said, look, you can see Christopher Columbus Park. You're actually catching people walking to the boats, and made a case that this was the best site. So that's happening at the same time that we're doing all this kind of brainstorming with IDO. And we were able to then bring the site choice and this kit of parts together to then start designing the building. So those were the options that we teed up to get ratified. This is November now. It's about a month and a half after we've been hired to get this ratified. Okay, the next step was then to try on the site that was approved now. Now, unfortunately, the plans are turned. So the water is below. This is the crosswalk to Quincy Market. Quincy Market's up here, so people are coming this way. This is all existing paving. And then the kind of water is that way. We then did a series of schemes with the kit of parts we'd worked out with IDO, including there was a map on the floor was one of them too. So this one was a kind of simple. We also looked at these relative to prevailing wind to make sure that environmentally they'd be comfortable during like the swing seasons. So here's a 3D digital view of what this scheme looked like. Simple. Any architects here? This was our Barcelona Pavilion scheme, right? You recognize it? So that was our famous building, 1929, by one of the masters of modern architecture. We were riffing off of that. George, I need your password.
Not to worry. Not to worry. It's a closely guarded national secret. Yeah.
So this was one option that we tried. Again, floor plan, the size of the map. This is now a digital model without the roof to show. These are now the exhibit panels for the islands that came out of the IDO process as a recommendation. The pavilions for storage and for the park rangers, and then testing how many people fit, and then the roof. There it is. And then we tested this in perspective to see what it would look like. Right? We're already immediately doing a perceptual performance test to understand how transparent it is through. Okay. A longer, thinner one with a canopy going in one direction. I'm not going to go through these in detail. Same set of drawings. Again, apples to apples. The maps caught between these two kiosks. Testing how many people could gather because the park rangers are very interested. If enough people show up, and if you go now, you can see this happening live, at least when the weather's good. When they can capture, 5 to 10 people, they gather them around, and they've got their Smokey the Bear hats on. And so they have some sizes for us. Again, here's a digital model with the roof removed. Those are the food cart, the little carts there. There's the roof. The roof coverage over, that's the shade, kind of where the shade would be. And then testing these in perspective. And then the double canopy. We thought, that roof is awfully big looking. Let's crack it. And then it could be a little bit more casual and more parky looking. And so prevailing winds. It also had some benefits in terms of protecting the wind coming from the upper right there. The double roofs. We broke it into 2 different kiosks. We moved the map so that it actually faced the big lawn. Tested the map. There it is. And there it is. Now, what's bizarre about this to me when I went through the old material a couple of days ago, is that this is pretty much what the project is. If you go there today, it's a little bit sexier looking, and the things have moved a little bit. But I was shocked to learn that only 3 months after getting hired, or even 2.5 months, the diagram for the structure and even the parts were pretty much in place. It's what is called, it's a little bit pretentious, the partie, which it's a long story that I can't tell, but it's the scheme, it's the diagram, this is called concept design. And then what happened was, I'm going to go through this quickly, these are the perspectives, is this was ratified. Again, we had to go to see all the public agencies, and people were pretty convinced that the scale, the scale of this pavilion against the larger park was better. The top one was too serious looking, and the roof was too big. The bottom one, that breaking it apart was the way to go. So there was that lag of persuasion and consensus building, we call it, that was required. We also shared some photographs of how we were imagining the pavilion would look through. We also proposed trees that weren't on the parcel to begin with. And we also proposed we wanted you to see this thing through a grove of trees. And this was the first image that we made of that concept where, without figuring out, we wanted the roofs to have some kind of curve. This was just done graphically. It wasn't done in 3D. It was just done. And this is where the whole debate about what it looked like started, which I think is also very germane to George's course, which is this was also the time we had our first general public meeting. And so I used some of the images that you just saw of the double canopy. This is now February 2009. And I had this image. And a woman, as part of the audience, raised her hand and said, "Oh, I know. It's supposed to look like 2 seagulls in flight." And I kind of saw it when she said it, but it seemed a little bit tacky to me. I said, well, I'm happy that you read that into it, because we like to design buildings that are figurative enough that people make their own stories about them, but it's not meant to be literally seagulls. And she's like, okay, fine, but I see seagulls. And I said, 2 seagull-like. So we became very aware that if you make a shapely thing, people want to name it. And it's my position on these things that you don't want to literally make a building that looks like a duck. It's my feeling you want to make a building that invites interpretation, but the broadest range of interpretations as possible, which is the opposite of the Statue of Liberty a little bit, I guess, right? And I'll come back to this issue in a minute. I also have been teaching a course at Northeastern now for 11 years on architectural topics, and one of the lectures I give is on roofs, on creative roofs. And so that I was finally going to have a chance to design a totally whacked out roof was also really exciting to me. Because once you disengage a roof from the walls, you can almost do anything you want. You don't have to worry about insulation. This is just one of the buildings that I show in my lecture on the roof. This thin shell concrete structure, a prototype designed by Amancio Williams, who was an important Argentinian architect, holding up the rebar. And this is what that roof looks like. So you also, as an architect, and if you're a hobbyist like I am, you live with daydreams of possible moves for the future. And so this became, for me, a roof project, quite literally. And so we didn't copy this roof, but this roof is always, I've always been jealous of this roof. The other thing that I thought of immediately with two roofs is another important work of modern architecture. This is the Heidi Weber Pavilion by Le Corbusier in Zurich that has two roofs that are different and the same. And in Corbusier's terms, were meant to operate kind of a logo shape that you would see from the lake. And so the other idea about the two roofs for me was that we would deal with a kind of structural purity of them, but also they would be iconic enough, not literally seagulls, that they would have a kind of presence in the park. And so, back to the kind of theme of the roofs. So the next step was to get the map size right, to actually figure out how big the panels were, to begin to get the pieces of the pavilion. I'm sorry, I'm turning around. We're now in March, to do the first perspectives to figure out the structure. And so in March, we figured out for the first time, this is going to be a composite structure, thin shell concrete, but with steel beams below. And that the beams were going to be sandwiched around the little column capitals and run across. And then we were going to dip the roof so that the upper roof drained water to the lower roof, and the lower roof was going to drain water into a cistern. So that was when the concept of that idea was going to drive the form making of the roof. So this is really now, very close to what the pavilion looks like. But that all happens, around March. And I'm moving very fastly. We were very paranoid about how big the map would be. So we literally printed it out, and we took it to Rose Wharf one day in 30-mile-an-hour gale winds with the clients out there and the park rangers, and they walked around on our paper map to make sure, and we got them to sign the thing, because that's how, it's a little bit like, I'm sure you're also too young to have ever seen Spinal Tap, the movie, where they got the scale of the stage wrong. So we wanted everyone to get a sense of the scale of the whole thing by doing a mock-up. And then we went to town and we designed this thing. So those are the original ideas for the map things, and that's where they ended up in the plan. By the way, each island has a panel that's near where they are in the map on the floor. Those ended up being two big sliding panels that close off the two kiosks. That's from the IDEO. Those are the maps. You can see them there. They open and close. That's actually an animation, believe it or not. The ticket kiosks ended up embedding in the back of the kiosks. The LED panels ended up going in, et cetera, et cetera. The PVs ended up going on the roof. Not this technology, a different one. And when the map panels close, LED art screens, which were a part of the original concept, were also implemented too. So this is proof of concept here, where things are starting to drop in. These are the bridge drawings between the original brainstorming and then moving into design development and construction documents. And this is the first time we then accurately drew two-scale digital models with the actual city behind to begin to register with some key historical buildings the foreground, background thing, And that helped us make material choices too. So this was all very key here. These perspectives, how it was actually going to look from eye level. Coming out of Quincy Market, it's the first cousin of the existing pergola in the Christopher Columbus Park. And then working the other way towards Quincy Market too. So we use perspectives to finally fix everything in plan. And then it even terminates the view from the pergola that runs to the north end, if you've been through that. And there you have it. And this is the water coming off the back. So moving ahead here. So we all kinds of options for where the water was going to land. Gary Hildebrand, the landscaper we work with, he's more of a metaphor guy than I am. Like, I hate seagulls. He's like, it's going to go into a thing that's shaped like the erosion of a beach. I'm like, okay, Gary, as long as it looks cool, and I like it, you can deploy all the metaphors you like. And then we started to test the lighting digitally too, the uplighting at night. And then, just before we went into working drawings, we had an inspiration, because we were working with a structural engineer, that we wanted to get the concrete slab as thin as possible. He said, it's going to be 6 inches. It can't be any thinner. I said, what if we split the beams in the middle? You see that? It's pretty cool. Wait, let me go back. Because splitting the beams, like fettuccine, more evenly distributes the load in the middle of the span of the roof, which means we were able to take 2 inches off of the concrete roof, and it just looks cooler because you're able to your eye can better map the contours of the roof now. That's almost like a contour drawing in landscape architecture. And so we did, these are very rough, but we did the Split the Fettuccine series. SGH, structural engineer, ran the numbers. There you go, and did that. We wanted it so badly we did 1 million views. We got to split the fettuccine. And so this brings us to this key moment, May, which is we started in October, May 2009, where we had been to see all these people at least. This is just a snapshot of all the meetings that we had. We had to see the Friends of Christopher Park, Greenway, Better City of Butters, Boston City Design Commission, Greenway. These are the remaining hurdles to full approval. This thing's all designed, by the way. Meeting with Mayor Menino, that was fun. He was in better health back then. And then the design development budget came in, and we were on budget. The budget was $4.5 million. So there was lots of happiness. And then there was, I'm not going to get into that, but it's very interesting because we predicted when we started that we'd be here in May, and it was in May. So I'm just letting you know how this thing works. And then we had one last design idea before it was time to go for it, which is that the drawings that I showed with the split fettuccine, we were working with a hydraulic engineer to get the pucker at the end to make the water flow nice. We were trying to design the flow of water like a nice Scandinavian pitcher, right? That you'd buy like in a mid-century modern thrift store. And he said, pucker it up more. So we puckered it up. And then he said, if it's on the same axis as the upper roof, I can predict the water. I don't know what the water's going to do when it's like this. It's going to swirl around up there and spit off the edge. And we said, that's actually cooler because that means that these things, even though they're unrelated, actually have a secret relationship, the axis of the curves. And it was just going to be, and we asked the structural engineer if we could actually fabricate this. He goes, it's going to be harder, but we can do it. So that's what we did. So we had this other series, which is the Twist the Back Roof series. You see that? And in case you missed it, we thought it was like a tongue, but that was like a disaster. Water went everywhere, and everybody was going to get wet. And then we had the pucker, and then we had the pucker and the twist. And then we made a physical model of it. Because the hydrology engineer said the only way you're going to know, actually, was these computer models, I don't know, is to make a physical model and run BBs down the roof, little metal balls. So we made a physical model, and we actually had fun running BBs down the roof. and they would like swirl around. It was I should actually we still have this. I should make an animation of that. So there's the model we made. It's about as big as that table, and that's the view on the top of this very beautiful little crease that ties the two roofs together. And it wasn't seagull. The beauty of it is that nobody saw a seagull ever again. But there is, I'll tell you a funny story that people saw other animals, but I'll save that for later. And then we had to work out, finally, the grid of the granite of the map, where the columns would penetrate, and how the map was going to slide into the ranger station. So we had to make a big physical model to finally nail down the actual specifications for the floor. You can see the little pinch detail for the fettuccine roofs there. And then we did the final design. We did a final run of perspective renderings, just the way it pretty much is today, just a final verification. Construction then, August, they actually didn't know how to build this thing. Well, we worked with the contractor all the way through. So we did, the question was, how do we integrate the steel and the concrete? And so this is a mock-up that was done at SGH's offices up in Woburn. This is what the final shop drawings look like. This is a shop drawing showing, a shop drawing is, okay, you do the construction documents, they become official bid documents, and then all of the subcontractors send you drawings back of their interpretation of how they're actually going to build the thing that you want done. So this is done by Keller. They were the formwork contractors. Concrete's dumb. The craft is actually designing the mold you're going to pour it in. And so they literally took our digital models and made the formwork through a CAD/CAM process with little robotic arms. If they didn't exist, we weren't going to be able to build this thing. So what you're seeing these are formwork ribs, every foot on center, tying into the structure, and then it's actually a 3D shop drawing. So this is a three-dimensional. These are the instructions for the robots to laser cut the ribs, to put the plywood on, to pour the concrete on. So here are the ribs in place. Each of these are custom cut from the computer model, but it doesn't matter. The robot doesn't complain about how hard it is. It just does what it's told. And then separately, the steel was cut by a laser cutter and then bent in a computer jig. And those are the pins so that the steel can go up into the concrete. There it is then. Now, there was a little sagging once it was poured, and there was a little bit of a panic attack. So until the concrete was totally cured, we put up these braces, and everybody's like, "Oh, util made it too thin," and it's fine now. This is January 2011. Oh, I just want to make a point here. I think that you can see the fettuccine steel now up in the concrete. What's really interesting is that you see where there aren't any grid lines. This is the lower roof now. In this section, the computer model said, at that point, you can't bend plywood anymore. So everywhere where there's a grid, because you can actually, in the computer model, you can plug in, quarter-inch plywood can't bend in it more than curve X. The computer model says, it works here, and then it doesn't work here. In that case, we had to build so here's the roof looking to the snout. You can see that the ribs end there at the end. We had to build a solid state piece of formwork, an actual solid chunk to plug into that thing, where otherwise on the rest of it, we could bend plywood on top. So that's right after the pour. You can see they're working in that direction. It was we did 4 on-site mock-ups before they got that right, because how you pour concrete at a 60-degree slope, it's craft. It's unbelievable. That's it, almost opening there. Trees are going in. Very cool moments where the two roofs come together. There it is in the winter. And then there it is finished. Oh, so one last story. I'm doing fine with time.
Oh, you're fine.
when we started drawing the perspectives, we had dealt with the seagull issue effectively. And I should have told the story a little bit earlier. So back when we had the single beams, not the same woman, a different woman at the next public meeting said, like, raised her hand. She goes, "I know, it's the bones of a whale." And I gave the same speech. I said, I'm glad that you've interpreted it that way, but it's meant to be open to many interpretations. I gave the exact same speech. And she said, fine, but it's the bones of a whale. So when we then opened the beams up, next public meeting, I kid you not, a third person raises their hand and says, "I know, it's the structure of a boat." So I guess my answer is it's the bones of a whale, it's the structure of a boat, or it's a seagull, it's two seagulls, it's whatever you want. So I think that might be it, George.
Okay. Fantastic. Thank you.
Do we sit here?
You join us over here.
Across from each other?
Yeah. It's like
it's Pat and Richard Nixon.
Pat and Richard Nixon, or I was going to say Boris Spassky and Bobby Fischer.
I see.
The World Chess Championships. Well, this one is easier than any of the others because, as Tim suggests, we've known each other and have been talking about these issues, I think, for a long time. But it's the first time I've seen a real recapitulation of the process of the pavilion. And I mean, you alluded to it both in your little anecdotes about the people at the meetings, but it's I think one place we could start is, at the end of the day, it's not just a question of architectural interpretation of this thing. This thing has to actually be different things for different people.
Right.
And I thought maybe it might be good to start with, I loved that you mentioned a couple lines that we've used in this course already. You talked about disaggregating the roles of the pavilion early on as a way of being able to recombine them without preconception.
I think this is an excellent point, because I was managing many invested stakeholders at the same time, and maybe I should frame who those were.
Yeah.
One is
and what their interests are.
The Boston Harbor Island Alliance is the nonprofit partner of the National Park Service. The National Park does that all over the country now, which is that way they can raise money and do things that the National Park Service can't do, and they literally partner around leveraging their business advantages. So National Park can get federal money. The Harbor Island Alliance can get private donations, and and it's a very healthy. I think because they had the unsuccessful first run, they actually, as a group, were well married and knew how to do it right the next time from their perspective. The Boston Harbor Island Alliance is mostly made of environmental lawyers who are completely visually blind. I mean, they could be looking at a chipmunk. I mean, and their interest was the sustainability argument. And so this was the first building in downtown Boston to have solar panels that could be fed back to the grid, which was a big battle I fought with some of the lawyers that were on the board with the NSTAR. Mm-hmm. And those solar panels that are up there, you can see them, they're demurely held back a little bit, required a lot of political capital. The mayor got involved. And for them, the building was about having the first solar panels that NSTAR was buying back.
Let me just interrupt. The problem with the solar panels was one with NSTAR not wanting them to feed back into the grid. It wasn't an aesthetic problem.
Well, I mean,
it might have been.
There's a new, expensive, flexible PV technology, but I should back up a half a step. We were able to make this a zero net energy building. So and the biggest electrical load, by the way, are the LED panels of the art screens and the display panels off to the side. And so, no matter what, it had to be zero net energy. You know what that means? Where what you make is what you give or what you use, and that was actually the criteria. Mm. So the problem with the flexible PVs is they aren't as efficient.
Right.
And we couldn't get the numbers to work.
Right.
So the more normative PV panels meant that we could get the numbers to work, but it actually required us to have low-resolution screens on the pavilion, or the numbers weren't going to work. But that was also a permitting advantage, because we only could get sign permits if those were low-res enough that it could only be art and not be advertising. So there was a weird alignment of the environmental lawyers, the BRA's fear of commercial signage, and the decor of a museum who are a partner for the art.
Right.
So I somehow got all those things to align. And so, yeah, so for Chief Justice Brennan is very involved with this, and he's a big art patron. He was the big art patron of the Ellsworth Kelly paintings in the new courthouse.
Right. Now, this is the Chief Justice for this district of the federal court system.
He's on the Supreme Court. Brennan. Chief Justice Brennan.
Wait a minute. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is not Brennan right now.
Justice Brennan.
Okay.
He's on the Supreme Court.
Actually, okay.
We'll look that up.
No, he's a former member of the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
But anyway,
we enlisted the decor of a museum to help us program the art panels, and they were interested in low-res screens.
Right. That makes sense.
So that all worked. But back to your story. So to one whole slice of the important stakeholders, which is the board of this organization that actually raised some of the money. That was what they cared about.
Well, see, this is
and the rainwater going into the irrigate the trees and.
Well, this is really great because you also said, the key in some of your early diagrams, solving more than one problem at a time. This is something we've talked about several times. That's one of, for us, I think, a kind of basic definition of good design is that it's doing that. And the irony, I'm so glad that you showed the purely architectural example early on, this Stephen Yablon, whom I don't know, so I have no horse in the race. But it was so clearly a purely architecturally sculptural proposal only. Now, to be fair to this guy,
it was a competition.
It was a competition, and they're often won that way, and in this case, it was won by him that way.
Right.
But this distinction, I just made a note here between architecture and problem solving in a way couldn't be clearer in that way. In other words, the only problem Yablon was trying to solve was, I want something that looks cool and maybe has some kind of metaphorical relationship to being an island. Right? And then there were some other there were some performance manifestations of looks cool, night view with lots of little screens, et cetera, et cetera. But once you get into the actual problem solving, it's a whole different enterprise, and it's just a completely different chart of decisions.
Well, we have an important motto in our office, which is put off design with a capital D as long as possible.
Right.
And because it's also critical for consensus building, which is that you don't know the most productive creative path until you know what everybody's interests are.
Right.
And this is essential, and it's the only way this building could have happened, which is that because those interests are actually very, very different. One is the Greenway Conservancy and having something fit in, relatively speaking. One is the environmental story. One is the story of the park rangers just doing the job well, right?
Which is increasing numbers, probably.
Increasing numbers. There are metrics for all of these things in a way. The attendance measured after this thing was built. They are running an organization like anybody else. So we were always very clear about identifying those individual stakeholders and making sure we were always adding their interest to the recipe, not to compromise, but to help us frame being as creative as possible.
This makes total sense. We often talk about how, at least I talk about how design and writing, good writing, are actually very analogous enterprises. Because, and you guys all, even if you're not architects, you all design essays, you design modes of communication. And often, and I'm sure you can all relate to the idea that sometimes you say, oh my God, I've got a paper due, I'm just going to start writing it, which is the equivalent of doing the design with the capital D right at the beginning.
Right.
And then you get halfway through it, and first of all, what is my point? Where am I going with this as I string these sentences together? And so the better thing to do is to do the analog of the IDEO process, which is to ask a series of questions that are relevant to the topic, and then, and in a way, put off the narrative until you know what you're trying to do.
Yeah, and I think that this is maybe more esoteric, but if you put off showing what it's going to look like as long as possible, if you unveil something this is a psychological insight. People are going to say, I got a better idea. So if we had unveiled two roofs with goofy curves early in the process, people would have said, but why isn't it, a single roof shaped like a banana, right? And you're like, why not? Because I'm the genius, right? And also, I'm not secure enough to know either. But if you bring people along, they're like, just show us what it looks like. We'll like it. Just you gotta. So finally, and then when you show them, they like it because it's finally because everyone, and you saw that list of meetings we had within a 3-week period has been slowly brought along. Everyone saw the Barcelona Pavilion 1 canopy, 2 canopy thing. I mean, I showed that at like 14 meetings, and so everyone buys the 2 canopies and they're cranked. So you're not going to fight that battle anymore, or you're not going to have a question because everybody's been brought along with that argument.
They're explaining it to their friends. And
then when you add rainwater running off, which has both environmental and poetic benefits, who's against that? What else does a roof do? And then you show that the way it works best is with a curve like this, and it also happens to look cool. You're a little bit immunized, and I'm not. I'm actually not that Machiavellian through the process because it's true. Because I'm carried along with the passion of I enjoy doing this, and so it's also this is a funny point I'm making based on your laugh that I always love things enough to pitch them, but not enough that if there's a change in direction, I don't then. I always know that there's another good idea. I don't. But when you get far enough along in the process, there's also little risk of the thing being completely pulled out because you've built out this case.
Well, this raises a great point, and of course, the putative role that you're playing in this course is about the design of public spaces, as opposed to, let's say, private homes
or toothbrush.
And we could actually talk about how product design is different because we had Chris Hacker of Johnson & Johnson who was just great on this. But it is really different, isn't it? And I mean, you guys don't do a lot of private houses or any. Have you?
No, we do them occasionally for. We just finished a house for one of our public official clients. Did you do houses too? We said, yeah, we do.
Yeah.
But I think the problem.
It wasn't McLaughlin, the housing guy from Chelsea.
No. Okay. The challenge with these projects is that there are many people. Imagine with a toothbrush, there's a focus group. Right. But those people don't really have a say. Whoever is managing the process makes a call based on all this research that's done. But the only outcome is whether it sells or not, and then that person loses his job if it doesn't. Right. Here, the board of the Harbor Island Alliance could have stopped the project. Right. The Boston Redevelopment Authority always has amazing control over approval. So if Kairos Shen and Pratap Pratos didn't like it, it was going to have to be something else. If the National Park Service head of the Boston regional office didn't like it at a certain point, there were important board members that were a lot of this was an earmark from Ted Kennedy, but there were some important donations from board members. If board member X wasn't enchanted with the final, perspectives that I showed, I think with a public process, there are more stakeholders that actually have a stake in the outcome than even an institutional commission.
Now, this is really interesting. I'm going to try to make a comparison here that not all of you will be aware of, but how many here are aware of a new, very modern-looking boathouse on the Charles River called Community Rowing? It's a big. Okay, so it's got the big.
You can see it from the pike.
Wavy wooden building and then a clear glass cube. Well, it's really interesting because a friend of ours, Alex Anmayan, who's also a superb architect in town, was recounting to me the public process on that building. Now, it's not as public.
It's pretty public, though.
It's pretty public. And what's really interesting is, I think, in terms of this whole, the advantage that you had here in a way was that you could approach this as almost completely precedent-free problem solving.
Right.
a pavilion. It's not a building per se. Then the making it all about roofs immediately made it atypical, and
Right.
it's not falling into a category. What a different challenge Alex faced.
Where there's lots of boathouses.
There's lots of boathouses, and by the way, they look a certain way.
Right.
They all look like they were designed in 1888
Yep.
in a shingled New England style, and they damn well that's what a boathouse is.
Right.
And that was a crisis problem for them.
Right.
And it was only the result. Now there were fewer stakeholders, but still significant ones. It was only the intervention of an enlightened senior public official that was able to overcome. That project would never have happened
Without leadership.
without real leadership, which is one of our.
Right.
At some point, I'll share the sort of 8 words that we've been using.
Nobody had to
for
step
this
up
course.
for this. It was a little bit more like you ever do a Ouija board?
Yeah, right.
It just kind of there was no strong personality.
No, but there was a very clear. I mean, what you guys
the
clearly
but the
did with
interests were
IDEA
clear.
was to
Right.
create a very clear agenda that, as you say, is separated from the solution. And I think that's really important when you think about it. Is really clarifying what is the problem that we're trying to solve, and in this case, multiple problems.
Right.
And not all of them maybe were as explicit as the 4 categories of things: excite,
Right.
engage.
Yeah, then not only to frame the problem better, but to have proto solutions that were disaggregated.
Right.
That
Right.
you could get by, like who would be against a map of the? Of course, there's going to be a map of the islands of this thing, and to
Right.
to even, I mean, because this in a way is a building without. It's not a classroom building with 17 classrooms of a certain size. The brief of this was very murky.
Right. Well, actually, what your slideshow needs, if I may make a suggestion, is an image of where the bar was on this, in the sense that the place that you used to buy tickets to go to the Boston Harbor Islands was, I guess I would call it a hot dog shack.
Yeah,
It
they still use that. Too.
Yeah, I know, it's just so shocking. Why do they do
Right.
that? But it's literally, it looks like a
Right.
something that you would trail behind your pickup truck.
Yeah.
And so the good news about that was you weren't coming in and replacing some venerated thing. I mean, that really plays a part in public
Right.
discourse, and especially in a historically oriented city like Boston.
So are we going to take some questions from students?
Well,
or-
actually, we're going to do a little bit more of this, and then we will
Oh.
definitely take some questions from students. I mean, you talked about a lot of this in your thing. I have a question about how branding and identity were involved. I think you really covered that in your presentation. And the project's overarching story or narrative, I think.
There's one thing I want to say about the shape of the roofs. I mean, maybe as a thought experiment, you should imagine if they were the same 2 roofs, but they were just flat, right? Just in your mind's eye. The problem is it would look like a gas station, right? And this was the fear of one of the board members, who Mimi called the man with the least imagination. In the early perspectives, when we're going through the one roof, he goes, it looks like a gas station. And so
You've already mentioned that, sir.
when the building itself has to be a brand in a way, it's where this issue of figuration actually has to step in. So nobody has ever said it looks like a gas station to me.
Right.
But it was always a little bit of a kind of problem to solve.
Well, I did have, and I mean, in a way, you addressed it in talking about the audience members' responses, but those were only during the public process. Now that it's been up for a couple of years, or a year and a half, or whatever, what are the most different reactions you've gotten to that building so far?
Everybody likes it,
Yeah, I agree. It's a universally liked
and I think that where I've gotten the most personal compliments is that we got the scale and size of everything right, which is always my biggest paranoia.
Because otherwise you end up fussing with details and you forget.
No, it's more you as an architect, even with the full-size map at Rose Wharf, even with digital models and a physical model, you can't exactly predict how big a building is going to feel. And some architects, for some reason, have the radar off one way. So every Bill Ron building seems like it's scaled up a little bit bigger than it should be. Like it's like, and he's a big guy, right? So to me, or have you been to Disney World or Disneyland before? Main Street USA is 7/8 actual size. So you feel, even though the heads are 9 times bigger than, but like architects get it a little bit wrong one way or the other.
Right.
And I was worried that it was either going to seem too big or too miniaturized.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Right. Yeah. Well, and Frank Lloyd Wright probably would be. People would say it's a little smaller.
A little small.
Than if
Right.
you've ever been in a Usonian house,
Right.
for example. That's interesting. So
The park rangers love it.
now, okay, now this is a question for given our shared interest and the interest at our school in prototypical design, and I know you come from a long history of this. This is an extremely one-off
Customized.
kind of building. How does that contrast with the way you approach other problems in your office?
Well, I think it's a good question. I think the methodology from a prototypical building is going to be about the same, which is that I think, let's say, for example, and we're working on a project now, we were hired by UConn to design an office building for them in downtown Hartford. Mm-hmm. It's kind of a thing that we're sort of working on now. In that case, for very rational reasons, an office building, a modern office building, comes with a particular configuration, and you've been in them before. They've got elevators in the middle of the building that face each other, as far away from the window wall as possible to maximize the amount of free leasable space to the window wall. This is an infutable logic that makes so much sense you can't rethink it. But are there other aspects of an office building? So from a real estate economic standpoint, it makes a lot of sense. But are there other aspects of an office building we can rethink? And so in a case like that, we put aside for a minute rushing in with all of our preconceptions. It's equivalent, I suppose, to
the idea process.
The idea process.
Disaggregation.
And saying, well, I get that it's called a lease span. That's gold to brokers. Can we rethink the way the mechanical systems run through? Can we rethink the lease spans themselves? Can we rethink, the distribution? Because in that case, what we're hoping to do with a building like that is to come up with a one-off building, but have it be the new gold standard, the new paradigm,
right.
that
the new prototype.
The new prototype. So, but it wouldn't really change the process much in terms of not taking anything for granted at the beginning.
Right.
If that makes sense.
Well, yeah, but I guess I was headed a bit more towards. There are so much about this is extremely site specific, and so, for example, let me get more specific in my question. Let's say the National Park Service calls you up tomorrow and says, Tim, we're so delighted with the effectiveness of this. We'd like you to consider rolling this out as a larger system of entrances to all of our parks. Now, we have, just so you know, some of our parks are rivers, some of them are mountains, some of them are the Appalachian Trail, the Grand Canyon, and so forth. What
would I do?
Yeah, that's a.
I would.
And that seems to me, by the way, a plausible possibility.
I would say, the coloration of the steel and, it also ties very closely to the National Park Service graphic standards. So it's very branded National Park Service. Even the color of the paint we used. My title slide was National Park Service graphic standards. And I would say to the National Park Service, I said, what we're going to do is that we're going to have the same kiosks and the same characteristics of steel to roof and the same spans. We're going to customize the geometry of the roofs and customize the direction of the water runoff, but I think that would work for you.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah. I'd say this still sounds a little too specific, but I'll take the second meeting.
Or at least I would roll that out as a test case, and I would say, so give me 4 test sites.
Right.
We'll test it.
That's
where
I was headed.
But I think that what the promise of that is that the beam to column details could be the same. The kiosk could be literally out of the box like a McDonald's franchise. And then the only customization would be the geometry of the roofs, but not the details.
Right.
Because you get into, you'd have to enter into business advantages right away. Branding and business advantages.
Right. Well, it could be that, yeah. Well, there's a lot of, but I think it's a really interesting point because there are aspects of these of a design like this that really could become very easily a kit of parts, and you might sort out the problem-solving sheet at the beginning and sort of tease out which problems are endemic to all the situations and which ones aren't.
One of the we had a very nice meeting with some of the grand poobahs from the National Park Service who all have beards, and and one of the guys who was very nice said, what I really like about this is it looks like it could be a shelter in the Adirondacks, but with urbanity.
Right.
That was a very nice thing to say.
Right.
So it does have a national park, and the slate sculptings we used for the kiosks. I mean,
Right.
We played the city mouse, country mouse thing a little bit. Right?
Very good. Okay. Okay. A couple other things that are sort of specific to Tim Love. You're very interested in graphic design, I know, as well as in architecture, urban design, planning, and so forth. How does that interest manifest itself in your office? In other words, as a kickoff, it would seem to me you have made communication a more explicit part of your firm's project and not a subsidiary means to an end, but that communication, this building is very much about public communication, and you sort of made that very self-conscious. I wonder if that manifests itself in other aspects of your practice.
Well, we run every meeting like a seminar. I'm an academic too, so we go to every meeting with a slideshow, which is meant to partly educate the client about maybe the issues that they should care about, but also through information graphics and diagrams to tease out for them and really for us live what the issues are we can get around. Right. Because what's key is that architects have their own idiosyncratic interests and clients have their own interests, and what matters is the point of overlap of those two things, and that has to come out by using information design as a tool in meetings to tease that out.
Right.
And so information graphics might be literally building diagrams, or it might be a chart that shows a demographic of usage, or it might be pedestrian flow diagrams to show why this is a better site than that one.
Right.
But there's always a way to visualize an issue to get people that think they're thinking the same thing to actually think the same thing, and that's important.
I think I told you I showed a few images, and you guys aren't going to remember it, so I'm not going to blame you for that. Tim's firm's analysis of the redesign of Broad Street, a historic street in downtown Boston. And you might think, what could be, could have been a very straightforward, standard enterprise. Somebody has to draw up where the new curbs are going to be, what the material on the sidewalk is going to be, how wide the street is going to be, if there's going to be trees on it, etc., where the lighting poles and so forth are going to be. This could have been an exercise that looked a lot like drawing a plan of a highway.
Right.
But you guys were able to, I think, reframe the agenda of what the redo of Broad Street was, and maybe you want to just say a couple words about that.
Well, I mean, it's a little bit more exciting than redesigning a highway, but we were able to do some analysis to convince the city. We worked with a transportation planner that all the lanes weren't necessary, but that the lanes themselves could be 10 feet in each direction and not 11. So we recovered an enormous amount of sidewalk that the city didn't expect at first.
Mm-hmm.
And given all that sidewalk area, we realized we could put trees where they weren't possible before. And then we designed this innovative paving so that the trees would actually get rainwater. So
without having to have steel grates around.
Without having steel grates around those, so the paving can right up the trees. We actually designed a custom perforated cast iron brick that would occasionally drop into the brick paving with holes for the water to get down to the trees. And we increased, like pixels, we increased the number of bricks closer to the tree based on some analysis that our landscape architect did. So it became a pattern too. So a series of rational decisions like this, of course more sidewalk space is better, and then of course we should have trees, and of course the trees need water, and of course everyone hates tree grates, and we need a pattern for all this brick now. There's so much. All were able to be brought together.
But aren't you leaving out one thing, or maybe this is something that was involved in the project?
Oh, the back and forth.
Yeah, which I think is so interesting. This is a street, a really historic street in Boston, but it had been straight.
Yes, we made the sidewalks different. The street actually zigs and zags a little bit because it's not a fast street. It's a kind of limited neighborhood street. So we put the bigger sidewalk in front of the buildings that were more likely to have outdoor cafes. So some buildings, like 40 Broad Street, where Fidelity is, was built in the 1920s with high bank windows. It can never have an outdoor cafe. They got a fine sidewalk, but we gave it all to the historic buildings across the street. Mm-hmm. And then it jogged back the other way because the opposite was happening. Mm-hmm. And then there was some historic pavement we wanted to keep, and that. So we did what transportation engineers don't do. We actually customized the curbs.
Right. Well, I just think that's a very good example of reframing the problem because it's at the overlap of different disciplines often like that.
Right.
And in our world, the disciplines of transportation planning and urban design or architecture have completely different sets of problems in mind. You know, the transportation people are always trying to make things go faster and more smoothly and with less likelihood of cars bumping into each other.
This is I think, you know, architects all say they do this, but I don't think very many do it to the level that we do. You know, this was designed by us, SGH, the structural engineers. You know, this was holding hands the whole time to do this. I didn't say I want this and make it happen. And also Gary Hildebrand, the landscape architect. So it really was, again, putting design with a capital D off as long as possible. You actually work out the issues with other experts that see things from a different direction slightly. Right. So it's a good point.
Here's what I think. I think we'll get some questions from the students, and then we might come back to I want to just talk about a couple of things about projects you did when you were with Machado Sovetti before you started your own business, because they're interesting in this vein. But do we have questions for Tim about what you've seen so far?
Just wondering what happens with...
Oh, here, just a second. I got to remember to do this. There we go.
Just wondering what happens with the snow when it gets...
This is designed for a lot of snow. I hope as much as showing up these days. But what happens is that it melts and the water dribbles from one roof to the other and the water comes off the end. So the other day I walked by after the big snow when there was a sudden melt, and there was a nice thing of water coming off the end. But there was a big chunk of snow up there. Yeah. The bigger problem is that the skateboarding community, when they saw these roofs, it was like their tongues were hanging out. And they were getting up there and they were skateboarding on the low one and filming themselves and then posting it on YouTube. And those solar panels are kind of expensive. So it was a little bit like park ranger cop, like mall cop trying to get the skateboarders off of there. And they were just taunting the guy. And so we had to get the lawyers involved about how aggressive the anti-skateboarder. If it was pigeons, it would be easy. You'd have like razor-sharp wires. Right. And so we ended up putting some wires up there, and there was enough enforcement that it seemed to stop. Right. But that was a little bit of a worry.
Right.
It was easy. They would like boost each other up there. They were up there. So that was the snow is not an issue, but the skateboarders.
Right.
And then of course everyone like, Tim, why didn't you think of the skateboarders?
Right.
You know they love concrete shapes.
Well, you know, actually, this is a great segue because, you know, since the sort of resurgence of skateboarding in I don't know how long that's been going on, at least 15 years, this has become a performance criterion for how you do, you know, benches and anything that's between elevation 0 and 5 feet in the public realm. Okay, Are you going to invite skateboarders to do this and have the kind of continuous reinforced metal edge that resists grinding? Or are you going to put the studs locked into the granite that will cause instant death by falling?
Well, the new solution, and Gary hated doing this because he's a purist, is the big blocks that define the wall of the lawn that we kicked up to get the trees to work, have at every joint a little piece of metal that comes out.
Right.
But they don't care. I mean,
Exactly. If your working plan is
Right.
to grind sideways and then jump
well, your
upside down.
board member Ron Drucker's biggest obsession is skateboarders.
Really?
Yeah.
That's hilarious. I'll have to make sure to mention that to him next time I see
Yeah.
you. Tell him I'm
Patrick
thinking
Rousseau.
about thinking about going skateboarding with my son down on Huntington Avenue where he owns a bunch of property.
what do you think of
You want to
that?
come? Right. Other questions? No, you can't ask another one. This gentleman. Here, let's. I'm not going to toss it. I should, but.
So as an engineer, most of the aspects that we judge our successfulness of our projects on are quantifiable, whereas this seems a lot more like public perception and what people sort of thought that the project was going to bring to this area. Can you speak a little bit more about how this project was a success in that sense?
Oh, in a kind of measurable sense.
Yeah, if there's any way.
Well, there was a lot of data collected about ticket sales to the islands, and that was I think for the client that was proof. Because what's weird about this project too is it's not that close to the boats. It was really put here more for symbolic reasons to brand the islands deeper into the downtown, and so there was a fear on part of the board, and Ted Kennedy's budget allocation helped smooth that over for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Whether this was going to have any impact on ridership at all, and there was a huge bounce as a result of the pavilion. So, like double years before.
Yeah.
And that might have been the PR around the building being designed and built itself. I think it is the effectiveness of the park rangers catching all the people coming out of Quincy Marketplace. But that would be, from an organizational standpoint, like hamburger sales for a new prototype for.
Yeah.
But I think the measure of success for the structural engineer, Paul from SGH, was that this is a completely digitally calculated structure, of course. It's not back of the envelope calculations. And he has had all kinds of professional success at conferences talking about the process for this building from his standpoint. The kind of biofeedback loop of minimal tolerances within margins of safety, and the interface between the structural modeling, the form making, and the fabrication.
Mm-hmm.
So he has his own professional metrics around. For him, it's innovative practice, which is that you couldn't have designed the structure 10 years ago. There's no way. The software didn't exist.
Right.
And you couldn't have built it 10 years ago. That's what's exciting to him about this building. That it's because I can a little bit.
Well, but I would say I think I understand where you're going. There are two, and they're very straightforward. One of them is ridership, which I know is way up. I mean, I know it anecdotally, but I'm sure that it would be easy to find how many people went to the Boston Harbor Islands in 2008,
right,
and how many went
2011.
In 2011, and it's way higher. Now, of course, as with a lot of things, you can't say that's the only factor, probably. But like, what if when Chris Hacker redesigns the Costco Band-Aid package into the 4 pods and sales double, it could be that people were just cutting themselves more. It could be a lot of people with serious psychological problems. What? Yeah, it could be skateboarding.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, it would seem that in the localized terms of this conversation, that Hacker's redesign of the Band-Aid package was probably quantitatively successful.
The other funny thing with a project like this is that...
And the other is the energy piece, which is clearly...
Piece, and then it's Tom Powers, who's the executive director of the Boston Harbor Island Alliance, getting through unscathed so he keeps his job. Right? I mean, not really because he's a great guy. I mean, I'm being facetious a little bit. It's probably Bruce, who's the head of the Boston District National Park Service, getting an A-OK from his boss in Washington. That was a great job, on budget, good press. So,
yeah, well, that's another quantitative metric, by the way.
Right.
By the way, that anybody who's ever hired an architect, wow, shut up, on budget, fantastic.
Right.
Not a given.
Right. On time, on budget.
Yeah, on time, on budget. That's
and no controversy.
Yeah. Right. Wow, I'm glad you asked that question, because there's a number of extremely measurable things, and you might say, well, what are you talking about? How are those things measurable? I would say, note to self, maybe for the next essay, compare this public project against another public project of a similar size that was way over budget, everyone hates, doesn't perform well, etc. And suddenly, wow, there is a big difference between good design and bad design. And it has lots of consequences that aren't only localized around the particular project, but as you say,
even political consequences.
Oh, massive ones. I mean, think about the Big Dig is a pretty is the same kind of enterprise, but on a much more enormous scale, and that's a much more mixed bag, frankly. Even if you really like the Greenway, there's a lot of people. There's a lot of political hay that's been made over the years about the fact that Boston and Massachusetts spent $18 billion, $17 billion on that, a lot of it national money. And so there are real consequences of that process going the way it did. Now, whether it could have been a lot better in the case of the Big Dig and the submerging of the Central Artery, I don't really know.
I think with public work, there's more consequences for sure.
Yeah.
There's more losers.
Yes. Yeah. Who else? Yeah, Paul. Just a second. Let's get the microphone. Is it? You want to pass it over there? Make sure it's on.
I guess my question is, with a project of this kind of small scale, but big scale presence, that process makes sense. But what's your philosophy on the role of that kind of design process in kind of larger architectural projects where the interests aren't so public?
Well, I mean, whenever a building is in a pre-existing city, I think the public interest is very much at stake. But their role in the process is actually much murkier, because here, public agency, public land, public goals. We are now involved with. We're in the running with a developer for Parcel 9, which is where the Haymarket is. You ever been to the Haymarket before, where they have the almost rotten tomatoes that are like $1 for 4,000 of them or something. There's a vacant parcel between the Haymarket and the Greenway that's shaped like a pizza slice, and we, for a developer, designed a building that includes some market functions on the ground floor, 3 restaurants on the second floor, and then in one corner of the site, 75 apartments, and it's owned by the transportation authority, but they're going to sell it to a private developer, and it's going to be privately owned. But it's next to Quincy Markets, it's next to the Haymarket, it's on the Greenway. The question then is, what role does the public say, and how much say does the public have in the uses in that building, the way it looks, how tall it is, its shape, what color the signs are, and it depends on your own political beliefs, I guess. You might say it's private property. Once they get it, they can do whatever they want, and that's the American way. Right. Or you might say...
Actually, though, almost no one believes that, and almost no one thinks that. Even the most libertarian Republicans don't actually think that, certainly not about the neighborhoods they live in.
Exactly. So, but then the big question mark is, what's the best balanced process that doesn't make it as public as this? Right. But still ensures a level of public responsibility from private actors. And that's even more interesting than this process. And if we're designated, it's going to be, another many meetings.
I should say this is actually something that is, of course, a real interest at our School of Architecture here, is investigating that process itself, because it's such a complex thing, as the subject of design study. In other words, is there a way to improve the representation of these various interests? because they really overlap. They're not, it's probably not the case that you can solve for all of them to 100% perfection.
Right.
I mean, for example, you've chosen to live in this. I always love this, by the way. Somebody buys a condo near Fenway Park. That's action number one. Action number two is, what's with all this traffic? Okay, now, Fenway Park was built in 1912 or so. You, sir, are how old? 28. Okay. Well, if you didn't understand that there were baseball games played at Fenway Park when you bought your condominium, it's not really their fault. You know what I mean? In other words, there are certain things that are a consequence of choosing to live near other people. And this is why it's a complicated issue to really accurately map and optimize, and by the way, arrive at a set of agreed upon metrics.
Well, here for example, in this building that we're doing for Parcel 9, we've got 3 restaurants on the second floor, and each restaurant has a terrace looking out in different directions as part of the dining experience. The North End doesn't want any restaurants in our building because they don't want any competition for Hanover Street. So they're against it.
Which is not exactly it's sort of a public interest, because it's not just one restaurant.
Yeah, but
it's not really a public
But then there's a whole other set of stakeholders that say, if you don't have those restaurants on the second floor, you can't build your building. And so what do? You've got to,
Right.
You've got to, I don't know.
As an indication of what a small city this is, and I'm on the public review committee on that parcel that Tim's talking about.
Right.
This is a small town.
It's the same 20 people.
Yeah.
And that helps and hurts.
Yes, it's true. The same actors. Other questions over here? How's Facebook? Any updates? Anything happening that we should know about?
How many of you were surprised that are architects how long it takes from getting hired to getting a building built? Or does that seem normal to you? I'm just curious.
This actually seemed efficient.
Seemed efficient?
Well, remember, he was presenting it in like 30 minutes, but...
No, I...
The timeline was quick compared to some of the other projects we've seen, actually.
Yeah, and I think that
Yeah, Blake's project for the which it's not the New England Conservatory, but
the Boston Conservatory.
Boston Conservatory was what, like 9 years? Yeah.
Yeah.
And by the way, that is not atypical in this town.
Right.
And it's not only approvals, but I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Okay. I was just curious.
Other questions? Okay. Who is our next guest? Who's up next on our calendar? Is it Peter Dixon? Are you guys taking this course? You are? Okay. We will see you again on Monday. I'd like to make a brief pitch for those of you who are interested in this whole approvals enterprise and this whole business about how things get built in the city. We're hosting, the College of Arts, Media and Design is hosting a symposium in the ballroom at Curry next Tuesday. Obviously, you don't have to come for the whole day, but there's 3 different panels on design and its role in sustainable cities. One on design and science, one on design and business, and one on design and policy. And I'll send you all the link to the webpage for that thing. You're more than welcome to come. Okay, thanks very much, Tim, and thanks to you all.